Well, the tide turns pretty quickly against Jesus in this gospel as he's preaching in his hometown. The people go from speaking highly of him in verse 22, and then by verse 29, they're ready to push him off the edge of a cliff. The riot breaks out when Jesus begins speaking about the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and more importantly, to whom they were sent. But we have to understand something first about Luke's gospel before feeling the full effect of what's happening today. First of all, our Sunday readings, you may know this, come from a 3-year cycle. And when we started the season of Advent this year, we began cycle C, which primarily uses the Gospel of Luke on Sundays. A is Matthew, B is Mark, and here we are in C with the Gospel of Luke. Luke, the evangelist, is considered by some, by many, to be of Gentile origin. Now, whether he was Jewish or not, it's clear that Luke has a heart for the Gentiles in his writings. He regularly expresses the invitation of Jesus to all the nations, which means that all now have access to the Messiah, to salvation, which is not determined by birth or by bloodlines, but by their faith in Jesus. In other words, Gentiles were outsiders, but because of their belonging to Christ now, they become insiders. And we see this insider-outsider tension throughout his gospel. We can see it in his version of the Beatitudes in chapter 6. We can see it in the sinful woman and the Pharisee in chapter 7. And we see it in the story of the prodigal son in chapter 15. All of these events highlight this tension, this drama that's building in the Gospel of Luke. Those who consider themselves insiders, people like the religious leaders of the day, find themselves on the outside, and those on the margins, like tax collectors and prostitutes, suddenly become insiders because of their faith. This is the dynamic that plays out over and over again in Luke's gospel. And this is what causes the outrage in the synagogue in Nazareth. Jesus is preaching to his hometown. He's preaching to his fellow Jews. And what his fellow Jews are asking, they're asking for a message, a sign just for them. He said, they say, look, you've done these things for people all over the place. Now that you're here, hometown boy, do it for us. Show us a sign. And Jesus does just the opposite. He speaks about Elijah, who was sent not to the widows, any of the widows in Israel, of which there were plenty, but he was sent to the widow in Zarephath, in Gentile territory. He's digging it in. And then Elisha was not sent to any of the lepers in Israel, even though there were many, but he was sent to Naaman, the Syrian, again, a Gentile. Now, for a people who loved the fact that they were a chosen people, as God's special possession, to hear Jesus say these things was infuriating. He is essentially saying to them, what you thought just belongs to you belongs, in fact, to everyone. It's something like being an only child, and then your parents have another child, and they take all your stuff, and they give it to the next child, and they give them all their attention. It's something like that. Needless to say, there's a lot of friction that's building between Jesus and this crowd. And this is what gets Jesus dragged to the edge of the cliff. This is the scandal of his teaching. When we hear him say that he has come not to bring peace, but to bring division, this is what he means. When we hear him say that he's come to set the earth on fire and he wishes it were already burning, this is what he means. Jesus is dramatically changing the rules of the game. And we have to understand how dramatic this is. He is shifting the covenant so that he becomes the reference point for salvation. And so belonging to him, not to a tribe or to a nation, is what opens up the possibility of salvation. Jesus, the ultimate outsider to humanity, because he is divine, takes on our flesh and becomes the ultimate insider, the source for life for all of humanity. And friends, what this does for us is raise a very, very, very serious question. Do we believe that just by coming to Mass and carrying out this religious practice, that it is sufficient to express our belonging to Christ? Because that's what they were doing in Nazareth. They were going to synagogue every Sabbath. Do we consider ourselves insiders simply because we come to Mass, or is there something else to our faith? I think that's a really hard question. Look at what St. Paul says in that second reading. This is not just a wedding reading. This is what he says. If I speak in human and angelic tongues but do not have love, that is to say, if I do not have this deep and abiding unity to Christ, then I have nothing, and I am just a hollow gong. If I can prophesy and understand all things and move mountains with my faith, but don't have within me this profound love of Jesus Christ that motivates every single thing that I do and everything that I love in this world, if Jesus is not the reason for everything that I do, then I gain nothing. Friends, this is a warning from St. Paul. Don't think that just because we keep external practices that we will be saved. Because salvation is not found there in the externals. Instead, what he calls us to and what Jesus imitates for us is a true love that is totally offered. This is the way into the heart of Jesus and the way to being a true insider. The word Paul uses in Greek for love is agape, which means total self-gift. It's divine love. It is the only way to love, to completely pour oneself out for the sake of the other. It's a love that's willing to take on anything for the good of the other, just as Jesus did on the cross. This is what St. Paul says is necessary for salvation. To enter completely into the heart of Jesus, so much so that we begin to love like God, that we begin to embrace others like God, that we begin to look at others as God looks at them. This is what St. Paul means when he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. St. Paul is saying we have to immerse ourselves completely in the love of Christ, which is not some touchy-feely kind of thing. It is this complete gift of self, a willing to be hurt, a willing to suffer for the sake of the people that we love. This is what St. Paul calls us to. This is the only way to the inside. And it's not through merely external practices or being a card-carrying member of the faith. It's through the heart of Jesus, with all its wounds and all its trials, This is how our names are written on the inside of the book of life. And so let's take a close look at our attachment to Christ. And let's ask the Lord to take our exterior worship and bring about an interior conversion.